The man never talked about what happened to his first wife. Not to his ranch hands, not to his neighbors, not to the preacher who came by twice a year with a bottle of rye and good intentions. In 11 years, Cutter Briggs had said her name exactly once. On the night they buried her, and that was the last anyone heard of it. He ran the Briggs place alone. 1,200 acres of high plains grass outside of Laramie, Wyoming, where the wind came down off the mountains cold enough to split wood, and the winters lasted 6 months if they felt like it. He had 2 men who worked the cattle, Ronnie and a kid called Spade who wasn't old enough to shave, and a cook named Ebb who came 3 mornings a week, left food in covered pots, and knew better than to stay. That was the whole of Cutter's world. He did not want it larger. She showed up on a Wednesday in late October, when the first real cold had come down and the grass had gone yellow, and the sky sat low and gray like a lid on a pot. Her name was Ansel Prewitt, 26 years old, with her daughter on her hip and a canvas bag over her shoulder, and a look on her face that had stopped pretending a long time ago. She'd walked the last 4 miles from where the truck had left her at the county road because she had no other options left, and she was the kind of woman who kept moving when she ran out of options, because stopping was not something she'd ever been allowed to do. She knocked on the front door of the main house and waited. Cutter opened it and looked at her the way a man looks at weather coming, not unkindly, but with assessment. "I heard you might need help," she said. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing." He looked at the child. The girl was maybe 2, with dark eyes that watched him without blinking. "Who told you that?" "Woman at the gas station in town," said Ebby. "Quit." "Ebby didn't quit. I let him go." "All right," Ansel said. "Then you need someone." Cutter said nothing for a moment. He looked past her at the road, as if measuring the distance she'd come. "I don't run a charity," he said. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." He studied her a moment longer. The wind picked up and pushed at the girl's hair, and the child turned her face into her mother's neck, but didn't cry. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said finally. "You can have it for now. We'll see how it goes." That was the whole of the negotiation. Her daughter's name was Blythe. She had just turned 2 in September, and she'd spent most of her short life in the passenger seat of vehicles going somewhere else. She did not talk much yet, but she watched everything. The way the cattle moved across the hillside, the way the horses stood in the early morning steam, the way Cutter moved through his own house like a man who had learned to take up very little space. Ansel kept the kitchen clean and the meals coming, and the floors swept without being asked. She was not the kind of woman who needed directions. She found out where things were, and she did what needed doing, and in the evenings she sat with Blythe in the small room off the kitchen and sang to her while the child fell asleep. She did not know, in those first weeks, that the walls of that house were thin. Cutter's bedroom was at the end of the hall, close enough to the kitchen that he could hear the wood settle in the stove, close enough that he heard when Blythe woke in the night and when Ansel got up to settle her. He lay in the dark and listened without meaning to, and after a while he began to mean to. She sang old songs. Things her grandmother had taught her. She'd told Blythe once when she thought no one was listening. Songs from the part of Tennessee where her family had come from. Songs about rivers and going home, and the particular ache of people who had been away too long from something they couldn't name. Her voice was not polished. It was the kind of voice that had been used, low and a little rough at the edges, the voice of someone who had sung in hard places and kept singing anyway. Cutter had not heard singing in his house in 11 years. He did not move. He did not make a sound. He lay in the dark with his eyes open and he listened, and when it stopped he lay there in the silence after it and felt something he did not have a name for. He told himself it didn't mean anything. The first snow came in November. Not a blizzard, not yet, but enough to close the roads for 2 days and keep everyone on the property. Ronnie and Spade bunked in the barn loft with the space heater they'd been using for 2 seasons. Cutter stayed in the house. Blythe, who had never seen snow before, stood at the kitchen window for 40 minutes the first morning and pressed her small palm flat against the glass. Ansel was making oatmeal at the stove. She watched her daughter from the corner of her eye with an expression that she didn't know anyone else could see. Cutter was at the table with his coffee and he saw it. He didn't say anything. After breakfast, he went to the barn and came back with a pair of small rubber boots from a box of things he had never unpacked and set them by the door without explanation. They were red. They were too big by a little. Blythe stared at them for several minutes after he went back outside, then looked at her mother. "Boots," Ansel told her. Blythe said the word back to herself very quietly. Later, Ansel put them on her and took her outside and let her walk through the snow for the first time, and the sound the child made, a short, involuntary sound of pure astonishment, carried across the yard to where Cutter was working at the fence line. He didn't look up, but his hands stopped moving for a second. He went back to work. There were things about Ansel Prewitt that Cutter noticed the way you notice geography. Not with attention exactly, but because they were simply there. The way she kept her shoulders drawn in when she first moved through a room, like she was used to making herself smaller. The way she checked the door before she sat down to eat. The way she slept with her door cracked open so she could hear Blythe, and the way she was awake and moving before he'd even heard the child stir. He did not ask questions. He had not been asked questions about his own life, and he extended the same courtesy. But one evening in December, Ronnie said something at supper that made Ansel's face go still in a particular way, and Cutter watched it and filed it away somewhere he wasn't sure he should be keeping things. Ronnie had meant nothing by it. He'd said something about a man in town, someone named Prewitt who'd been asking around. Just passing it along, he said. Thought maybe she'd want to know. Ansel had said thank you in a voice that didn't move. She'd eaten the rest of her meal in silence, and after supper she'd put Blythe to bed, and then sat in the kitchen for a long time with the light on, and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. Cutter sat in the next room. He'd stopped pretending to read. He couldn't hear what she was thinking, but he could hear her breathing, and after a while he heard it slow down from something tight to something that was just tired, and then he heard her get up and pour the cold tea out and go to bed. He sat there a while longer. In the morning, he drove into Laramie alone. He was gone for 3 hours, and when he came back he said nothing about where he'd been. 2 days later, Ronnie mentioned that the man named Prewitt seemed to have stopped asking around. Ansel looked at Cutter across the breakfast table. He was reading the paper. She didn't say anything. He didn't look up. But something shifted in the house after that. Nothing loud. Nothing named. The way the air in a room shifts when someone who has been bracing themselves finally lets their shoulders drop a little. Christmas came quietly. Ansel made a pie from the canned peaches she'd found in the pantry and put a small painted pine cone on the table that Blythe had decorated, badly with red paint she'd found somewhere. Cutter came in from the cold and looked at the table, and then looked at the child, who was watching him with the same unblinking assessment as the day her mother had knocked on his door. He pulled a small wrapped package from his coat pocket and set it on the table in front of her. Blythe looked at it. Then she looked at him. "It's yours," he said. "Go ahead." She tore the paper off carefully, the way children do when they're not sure they're allowed to be excited. Inside was a small wooden horse, carved and painted brown with a white blaze on its nose. He'd made it himself in the evenings in the workshop, though no one had seen him do it, and he had not mentioned it. Blythe held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at Cutter and said, "Clear as anything. Horse." "That's right," he said. And that was that. But Ansel had to turn away to the stove for a moment, and when she turned back, her eyes were dry and her face was composed, and she served supper like nothing had happened. He ate everything on his plate. The hard part of winter came in January, the kind of cold that was not a temperature but a presence, a weight on the house, on the land, on every living thing trying to hold on through it. The cattle had to be fed by hand. The pipes in the barn froze twice. Ronnie got sick, and Spade worked twice as hard, and Cutter worked beside him from before dawn until after dark, coming in with ice in his beard and his hands cracked and bleeding despite the gloves. Ansel kept hot food waiting every time he came inside. She had learned by then how he took his coffee, what he'd eat and what he wouldn't, how long he needed to just sit before he could talk. She had learned the rhythms of him the way you learn a house, by living in it long enough to know where the cold drafts came in and where the light fell right. She told herself this was practical. This was what it meant to work for someone. She told herself that more than once. One night in the worst of it, Blythe woke with a fever. Not terrible, but high enough that Ansel was up with her for hours, a cool cloth on her forehead, singing in a low voice to keep the child from crying. The wind was bad outside. The house creaked and settled around them. Cutter appeared in the doorway of the small room at 2 in the morning. He'd pulled on his work pants and a flannel shirt, and his hair was pushed to one side, and he looked like a man who had not been sleeping. "How bad?" he said. "She'll be all right. It's not she gets these sometimes. It'll break by morning." He stood there a moment, then he went away. Ansel thought he'd gone back to bed. He came back 10 minutes later with a mug of something. Ginger tea with honey, she realized, and set it on the small table beside the cot. "For her," he said, "when she can take it." Then he sat down in the chair in the corner and did not leave. He didn't do anything. He didn't try to help or take over or fill the silence with talk. He just sat there in the corner, present in the dark the way a person can be when they are simply choosing to stay. And Ansel kept singing, softly, and Blythe's fever broke a little before 4 in the morning, and the child finally slept. Cutter had fallen asleep in the chair by then. His head was back and his arms were crossed, and he breathed slow and even. And Ansel looked at him in the thin gray light coming through the window and felt something pull in her chest like a thread being drawn taut. She sat with that feeling for a while, and then she tucked it away where she kept things she wasn't sure what to do with. She covered him with the spare blanket from the foot of the cot. He was still there when she woke up 2 hours later. He was awake by then, sitting quietly, and when she startled, he just shook his head a little, like she didn't need to apologize for sleeping. She didn't know what to do with a man like that. That had been the problem from the beginning. Spring came slow, the way it does on the high plains, not all at once but in degrees, the cold retreating a little and then coming back, then retreating further. The mud was something to contend with. The calving started and nobody slept much, and the house smelled of coffee and lanolin and the good dirt of something new beginning. Blythe learned to walk to the fence by herself and call to the horses. She had names for all of them, private names she'd invented, and she told the horses her names very seriously, and the horses bent their heads toward her, and she accepted this as their agreement. Cutter watched her from across the yard one afternoon, and did not know what was happening to him exactly, only that it was happening, and had been for some time. He'd been careful. He'd been very careful. He knew what he was, a man who had loved someone and buried her and built a wall around what that had cost him. He knew what it meant to let something in that you would grieve when it left. He had done the math on that particular equation, and he had found the answer wanting. But Ansel was not trying to get in. That was the thing. She was not pressing against the wall or asking him to lower it. She was just living in the house and doing the work and singing those songs in the dark, and the wall was coming down anyway, stone by stone, because of the way she moved through his life like she was not trying to take anything from it. Only add. He didn't know what to do with that either. In April, she told him she'd been thinking about moving on. A friend in Colorado had offered work, she said. She wanted to tell him in advance so he could find someone to replace her. He was at the workbench in the barn. He didn't turn around. Is that what you want? He said. A pause. I think it's time I figure out what's next. For me and Blythe. He turned around then. She was standing in the doorway with the evening light behind her, and she looked tired and honest and very young, and also not young at all, in the way that some people have of carrying both things at once. You don't have to go, he said. She looked at him. I know that. I'm not saying it because I need the help, he said. Ronnie's back. Spade's decent now. I can manage. He stopped. This was not something he knew how to do. He had not done this in 11 years. I'm saying it because I'd like you to stay. And Blythe. He picked up a hinge he'd been cleaning and put it down again, which was not useful, but it gave his hands something to do. I'd like it if you stayed. Ansel was quiet for a long moment. You should know what you're asking, she said finally. I come with complications. I know that. You don't know all of it. I know enough. She looked at him a long time. The horses moved in the stalls behind him. Outside, Blythe was somewhere in the yard calling a horse's private name. I'm not easy to know, Ansel said. I've been told that. I'm not trying to know you fast, he said. I've got time. Something in her face changed. Not much, but enough. She didn't say yes that night. She said she needed to think, and she went inside, and she put Blythe to bed and sat in the kitchen in the quiet, and Cutter stayed in the barn longer than he needed to, working on things that didn't need much working on. That night, very late, he heard her singing again. He lay in the dark and he listened, and he understood that she had made her decision. Not because of anything she'd said, but because the song she was singing was the one she only sang when Blythe was deeply, peacefully asleep. The long one, the slow one, the one she sang when she was not afraid of tomorrow. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep for a while, but not because anything was wrong, because something was right, and he'd forgotten what that felt like, and he wanted to stay inside it a little longer before the morning came. She stayed. She didn't make a pronouncement about it. She just didn't bring up Colorado again, and in the morning she made breakfast and Blythe brought her wooden horse to the table and showed it to Cutter as if he hadn't seen it before, very seriously, waiting for his assessment. Good horse, he said. Blythe considered this. Then she nodded, satisfied, and went back to her oatmeal. Ansel was at the stove and she did not turn around, but Cutter saw her shoulders settle, just slightly, the way they settled when something had gone the right way. Summer came in hot and sudden. The high grass went green and then gold, and the cattle spread across the pastures, and the days grew long and easy and full of work. Ansel planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, and Blythe followed her through it, narrating everything in her particular way, very serious, very certain. Cutter built a taller fence around it so the deer would stay out, without being asked, without explaining himself. There were conversations, there were silences. There were evenings on the porch, when neither of them said much and didn't need to, and there were other evenings when the words came easier than either of them expected, and they talked until the stars were out, and the temperature had dropped, and they were still there. He told her, one of those evenings, about his wife. Not everything, but the important parts, who she was, what she'd been like, how the house had felt after. He'd never told anyone any of it. He sat on the porch step and told Ansel in a low voice, and she listened without trying to fix it or make it mean something other than what it was. And when he was done, she just said, "I'm glad you told me." That was all. It was the right amount. She told him in pieces over weeks about Blythe's father, about the years that had cost her, about the canvas bag she'd carried for 3 years that had everything she needed in it, because she'd never been sure when she'd need to leave. She told him about the particular loneliness of being afraid in a place that was supposed to be home. He listened the way she had listened, without trying to fix it. By fall, he had taken the canvas bag out of the closet in her room, with her knowledge, with her permission, and put it in the storage space above the garage. Not thrown away, just not needed in the same place anymore. She found a different bag, eventually, a bigger one, the kind you unpack. The kind you unpack because you're not going anywhere. There was no single moment when things became what they were. No declaration, no ceremony, no thunderclap. There was just the accumulated weight of ordinary days, morning coffee and fence repair, and Blythe growing taller, and the horses, and the mud, and the good meals, and the late evenings, and the knowing of each other, the slow, sure knowing that builds between people who have decided to stop being careful. He asked her to marry him in October, a year from when she'd first knocked on his door. He did it badly, standing in the kitchen, holding a wrench for some reason, the way he'd held that hinge in the barn. He said the words directly, without ceremony, and waited. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence. He put down the wrench. She laughed, which was a sound he had come to keep very carefully, the same way a man keeps something irreplaceable. They were married in November, before the first snow, in the living room of the house with Ronnie and Spade and two of Ansel's friends from town. The preacher was brief and sincere. Blythe wore a white dress Ansel had made and carried the wooden horse as her contribution to the proceedings. It was cold outside. Inside, the stove was going and the house was warm the way a house gets warm when the people in it have stopped pretending to be somewhere else. Blythe fell asleep before the cake was cut in Cutter's arms, still holding the horse. He sat in the big chair by the stove and held her, and talked to Ronnie about something neither of them would remember later, and Ansel stood across the room and watched him and felt the particular fullness of a life that has finally, after a long time, found its correct shape. She had come here with a canvas bag and nothing certain. She had come because she needed work and a door to knock on and a chance. She had not come expecting this. But here it was anyway, the warmth of it, the weight of it, the way a home feels when it is really yours. Not because of a deed or a name on a mailbox. Because of a man sitting in a chair by a fire, holding her sleeping daughter like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because of all the nights she had sung in the dark, not knowing anyone was listening, and all the nights he had lain awake, listening and choosing, quietly, without announcement, to stay.